Hi everybody, I'm Scarlett and again I'm talking with Rick Mooney, author of great cello books. And among those great cello books is Position Pieces. Hi Rick, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you so much.
Well, today it's Old Year's Day. Thank
Yes,
you for sparing your time for me. We're going to talk about Position Pieces. You are going to give us a guided tour. Why?
well, there are things that I think might not, let me put it this way. I tend to think that the pieces in the book are pretty obvious, but a few things have occurred recently which made me think that sometimes people don't actually get it. And I'm going to be very happy to talk to you about my ideas. The pieces themselves will run through that, but the ideas is what I'm really interested in sharing today.
Great?
Okay,
Yeah.
so one of the things that we want to be sure, ladies and gentlemen, is that you all have your book, your position pieces book, because I'd like to be sure that as we page through it, we can go together with that. Now, having said that, I have been thinking about this session for several weeks. And it turns out that I have a lot of ideas. I have concept that I want to talk to you about. And my idea is to give you what's going on in my mind when I was making the book. And then when we talk about the pieces, it can relate then to these concept ideas. All right. So I'm going to talk a bit before we actually get to the book, and I'm going to rely on Scarlett to help me. If I start repeating myself or talking too much, go like this, and I'll move on to the next topic. Okay. Um, First of all, just so you know, for me, in my own personal experience, I knew first position, I knew fourth position. I would do anything to avoid playing this A with fourth finger. I couldn't do it. I would go back and forth, and back and forth, and back and forth, and back and forth because I couldn't do it. It occurred to me one day, if you put your second finger on that G, which is not that hard, well, A is waiting. And as soon as I realized that, now I play that all the time. If you want to play a single note with vibrato and not an open string, and you don't want to go all the way here, it's such a great, handy, helpful fingering. But that's the way I myself figured out how to finally do it reliably. And there you go, almost sort of the birth of this entire book. I have a colleague who says something that I find very interesting. I have not a lot of firsthand experience with this, so take it for what it's worth. She says that the cello pedagogy, as the cello is emerging from an accompaniment baseline instrument into a solo instrument, relied heavily upon the violin tradition, which is very long and very deep. And therefore, people, I know this for a fact, cello pedagogy has changed a lot in the last 50 years. I can say that for a fact because that's how long I've been playing the cello. But I imagine it evolved even before that, which I can't speak to a lot. But she says, okay, violins go from first to third, first to third, first to third. Cellos then, as they were adapting into a solo pedagogy instrument, first to fourth, first to fourth, first to fourth. Violins went 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 all the time. Hence, cellos did that as well. Now, the fact that I have to back this statement up is that I worked on the Baroque Concerto, which is a cello trio composed by Rudolf Motz. And I was actually amazed at how many times this open hand position occurred in his editing marks, when nowadays we're going to close our hand and do some of the in-between positions between first and fourth and first and fourth. So I believe that this is partly just an evolution of what is going on with the cello pedagogy, with the way we teach and the way we think about the instrument and the way we play. We're coming into our own in terms of what truly fits the instrument. Here, for the record, my understanding of how we name positions on the cello is this. You go on the A string with your first finger. Each time the first finger encounters another natural note, that's the name, that is the next position. So here is one first position. When your first finger relies on C, it's second position. When it arrives on D, it's third position. When it relies on E, it's fourth, F is fifth, and so on. This is how I understand the positions were named. Okay, so the problem is we got this place in here. What happens when your first finger's on C sharp? Well, people used to call that maybe second and a half position. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's descriptive enough. But there's our problem, is we have a half a step, a semitone here, and a half a step here, a semitone here. And that means that the terminology cannot be completely consistent. You've got to figure something out. I have made two decisions about this. One is I have named them differently. I don't call it second and a half. And I don't actually think I made these names up, though I cannot tell you where I heard them for the first time. Honestly, I cannot remember. But if I've got upper second and lower second and extended second, okay, suddenly we've got some terminology that makes sense. Lower third, upper third, extended third, suddenly that makes sense. So those are the terms that I chose to adopt. Further, I don't like this idea of thinking about first finger. And that is only not a concept idea, it's a technical idea, it's a pedagogical idea. There is a very specific and famous place in Suzuki Book 2 in the Witch's Dance. Sorry. I've been told not to play too loud so that my cello playing does not overload the microphone. So you can help me out, Scarlett. Go like this if I need to be louder. Go like this if I need to be softer, okay? This place in Witch's Dance. All right, well this, the students will arrive on this note and it's fine, but they're totally out of position for the rest of these notes. And then they tend to want to stretch for them and it doesn't work. So my idea is, let's not think about C. Let's think about D and form the shape for the entire pattern all at once. And then there's those notes, then they're done, see? So we learn not to go from note to note to note, but from group of notes to group of notes and fingering pattern to fingering pattern, which helps us a lot with passages, especially quick ones, where you've got to be ready to move and not, and you know, again, in groups and patterns. Another concept. I don't use a lot of etudes when I teach. In fact, I actually like Dozart etudes. I think some of them are very tuneful. In fact, Schroeder has collected quite a few nice etudes. Here's my problem with them. Many of them are very long, and they have a lot of points in them, a lot of teaching, learning points in them. So as to you might spend exactly the same amount of time learning a Dozart etude as you would learning the time you would take to learn the Breville C major sonata, for instance. And when you're done with it, well, what have you got? You got a Dozart etude. When you're done with the Breville, you got a piece that you can play and perform. So I don't like to spend the time on those long and complex etudes. Further, I find that they are complex enough that it's not always obvious to the students when they're doing it correctly. I used to have my very best students go and work all week on an etude and make a mistake and not even know they made a mistake and practice it wrong for the entire week because the etude was simply not clear enough or obvious enough for my students. Now we got to remember that Dozart was probably composing for teenagers and adults, and I'm teaching pre-teens, you know, and I've got my 8-year-olds that I need to help them, right? And so I don't use those. Now here's my definition of a really good etude, something that is relatively short and is kind of tuneful with a very specific learning point in it. And this is why I have included, since we talked recently, the Kummer etude in my double stops book, because this is a cute tune, and it has one point. It has one point. You work on this. This is why I do the Lee etude. This point, which is in Saint-Saëns concerto, right? So a relatively short, relatively tuneful piece with one specific point, which brings me to the next thing. I prefer, rather than etudes, I prefer the concept of daily exercise. Now, there are books out there. You all know the Fouillard daily exercise. You open the book, and the first thing you want to do is close it again and put it aside because it looks so awful. And what you need to understand, and I didn't understand it at first, but my teacher taught me, you not do a page, you don't do a line, you do a measure at a time in the Fouillard daily exercise book. You do a measure at a time, and one measure by the next measure, by the next measure, by the next measure. Ultimately, you have a very short thing that you can do many, many times without taking up too much time in your practice day, and you learn a lot of technique over time. The problem with that, again, is it doesn't sound like anything. None of those things sound like anything. They're all dull. And again, for my preteens, I need to give them something that they can hear. I need to give them something that they can recognize when it's right and when it's not. So, but the concept of daily exercise, a very short thing that you can do many, many times correctly, and then again, over time, you learn a lot. And it doesn't take you hours and hours and hours in your practice day to accomplish it. All right, so As we begin to think about the Position Pieces book, I decided here, I think I mentioned this to you before, but I'll say it again here because people may not have heard the previous session. I don't think I invented a lot of these concepts. These concepts have been out there in the world. Janos Starker, for instance, I heard him speak about teaching. He talked about the fact that one of the hardest things about on a stringed instrument is the diminishing interval and the fact that your hand's got to change on every half step. One of the things he talked about was you've got to know in any place on the fingerboard what is available to you on all of the strings right there. I think it's Richard Slavich who used to teach in Colorado. When he was talking about pauper etudes, he talked about the village where all the notes, all the people in the village you got to know in any particular spot on the fingerboard. This is all over my books, and I didn't invent that. But what I did was I brought it to a level that my preteens, that my 8-year-olds can deal with. And that's I think what I've done, what I told you before. When I was talking about this book, when it was first published, my lecture was called Sink or Swim. And the reason I called it that is because I and many others like me back in the day were thrown into the deep end of the pool without preparation. And you either learned to swim or you did not. And if you learned to swim, you were called talented. And if you did not, they suggested you do something else with your life. My job, as I see it now in retrospect, is to put the shallow end on that pool and let my kids, my children, go step by step into the deep end. And once they get there, it works. Once they get there, it's fine. All right, so how do we find our way around the fingerboard? I have chosen to use this system called targets. Okay, that's my term, targets. I used to call them landmarks. I used to call them lighthouses, you know, whatever. Here's a funny one. I mean, this is a little off topic, but do you remember the old maps of the world when everything was sort of in the Mediterranean area, right? And everybody knew everything in there, and all those were very detailed and very, you know, complete. You get out here, well, there's a few more things, and you get out here, you know what they used right on the maps? This is the truth. Here, there be dragons. That's what they used to say on the maps. Cello, everybody knows this. Everybody knows this. Well, here, okay, and here, there be dragons. No one knows how to get around up here. And so we have to develop targets, lighthouses, you know, and landmarks to help us get around. So what I have decided, my definition of the target is a note that can be tested against an open string or a harmonic. And that's the way that I make sure that my students know that they're gonna be right when they do it at home. And this is one of the huge things that I wanna make sure is that when I give them an assignment, they know how to do it and they can go home and do it correctly without my supervision all week long. So the very first one being in the book, this D. And we put second finger on it and we got upper second position, okay? Another concept, if I may say please, ladies and gentlemen, take the tapes off the fingerboard. Take them off, okay? And I'm saying this for lots of reasons. Most recently, I happened to see a performance by a girl who actually played the cello very nicely, but there were tapes all the way up to here on her fingerboard. She had all her pieces memorized, which was very cool, but partly that's because she spent her whole time looking at her left hand and the tapes. And when I used to travel a lot, nowadays we don't travel much anymore. I would go to a place and we'd have this, and I'd make a little joke, you know. So John's sitting in front of me, let's say, to make up a name. John is sitting in front of me, and I say, "Hey, John, look, imagine 5 years from now, 10 years from now. You walk out on stage in front of the orchestra and you're going to play the Saint-Saëns Concerto and you have 147 tapes on your fingerboard." You know, and of course I exaggerate it. It's ridiculous, but it makes the point. At a certain point in time, no tapes on the fingerboard, right? And my whole system here is about muscle memory and ear and knowledge. Okay, I'll come back to that. We'll be talking about it a lot. The point being that if you got to rely on a tape, what happens when the tape vanishes, right? Now, having said that, I do put marks on the fingerboard at the beginning, because I think it helps the children who don't have the feeling yet of the hand shape to get that. I also think it helps the parents who may not have a finely tuned musical ear, who cannot really tell if it's really right or not, to help the students when they play at home. But what I use are these little dots. They're little dots, they're not tapes, okay? When you put a tape across and people put like card detailing little stripes, part of the problem with that is inertia. They never come off. You know, you have to make a conscious decision to say, okay, let's take this off and let's get a little rubbing alcohol and get rid of all the gummy stuff underneath it, you know, and it becomes a big deal. So they tend to stay on there just from inertia. My little dots fall off. And if I decide that they need it still, I'll put it back on. But comes a day I say, hey, let's just try without the dot. And it evolves at that point. I will mention one other thing. I do put a mark for a thumb. In the United States, this company called Dr. Scholl's does stuff for feet. And they have these little corn pads. They're round, and you can feel them. And I put the corn pad for the thumb. Other people put other things. They put a bump or something. That's fine. I agree with all of that. My idea being that even when I give them dots, the students do not get to look at the dots. I tell the students the dots are for their parents. They're not supposed to look. When you look at the dot, number one thing that happens is your shoulders twist and your elbows are wrong. Number two things that happens, you become dependent upon the visual. And I don't want the visual, I need the muscle memory, okay? But I do think that the dot on the thumb gives them something to feel and at least gets them in the right place. I put the dot on the outside of the neck here, just a little on the outside. If you put it too far under, the wrist goes this way. If you bring the dot a little to the outside, the thumb mark, the corn pad, you put your thumb in the right place. And then I call these guys the magnetic fingers. And how cool is a magnet? They want to stick together. You put a piece of paper in between them, they'll still stick together. And these magnetic fingers put us on the place where all the other notes fall. Okay? The bottom line of this entire discussion is by the time my students are in the second half of book one, there are no marks on the fingerboard at all, except for one, which I will tell you in just a moment. Okay? No marks. And it's all about how does it feel? How does it sound? I understand that scientifically muscle memory is sort of a vague definition, but we do it. We have muscle memory. And I tell my students, it's dark in your house, you go to your room and it's dark, well, you reach right out and flip on the light because you memorize where that is. You go to somebody else's house and it's dark in the house, you gotta feel around for the light because you don't know where it is. But you can memorize how things feel. You go out in your car at night, you put the key right in the slot and turn it on. And if it's somebody else's car, you gotta look around, right? So we have muscle memory, and I'm gonna use that term even if scientifically it's hard to define, because I believe that among many other things, we can actually memorize how things feel. All right. I would like to talk about one final thing before I actually get to the book. I would like to talk about some of the pre-shifting things that I do with the kids before we even start about shifting, things that I do in book one. One of the things, and I learned a lot of this, by the way, I'm going to have to give some credit. I learned a lot of this from Margaret Rowell in California. And she was very, very good at naturalness of motion and using your body in a way that worked easily, properly. And one of the things we need is this sort of action in our arm. If we're going to shift, we cannot have tension, right? Let's just leave it at that. So here's a pre-Twinkle exercise, not a pre-Twinkle, this is wrong. Here's a book one exercise that I do, and especially I would do this in group class when we had group class with Suzuki students. Long ago, the big kids would play the tune, and the little kids would play this, which we call ski jumps. You run your fingers up the fingerboard, and as you come off the end of the fingerboard, you get a little pluck on the note. La, 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 and so on. It would go through the whole piece. 2 notes for harmony, right hand, left hand. Realizing that even though when you look at a cello player play, that looks like these are 2 different sort of functions, mostly it's not, okay? Mostly it's connecting your weight from your back and balancing here on the instrument. I do leave a dot on the harmonic place. This is what I mentioned when I said I no dots. After in the second half of book one, the dots are gone, but I leave one here. And I leave it here because I like to do this. I like to have my students play the harmonic and get their arm around and come up. We work hard on these knuckle knocks, and the flexibility and the angle of the shoulder and the elbow that gets us around the fingerboard with ease. And we just plop the hand down and go. Kids have got to be taught a little. They'll do weird things, okay? You've got to teach them a little. But mostly it's just the blob and the plop. And so I call that a cuckoo, like the little cuckoo bird. And the big kids will play rigadoon, La, 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 la. And the little kids will play the cuckoo. Bum, 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 bum. Bum, 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 bum. Every dotted half note, I don't, you guys use that, or quavers, or dotted half notes make sense? Fine.
Yes.
Good. Every dotted half note is cuckoo. Now I'll give you the super bonus challenge version of this just for fun. The big kids like this one. Okay. Oh, down small, softer. Thank you. Now, that's the highest, hardest version of that. There are several steps along the way, but can you see the point, right? Yeah, this idea of having our arm. Every time I ask a student to move their hand, they're releasing any tension in their thumb. Because this is the big deal here, is tension in their thumb. Anytime I ask them to move, they gotta let go. And that's one of the reasons for these kinds of exercise. I do book 10, what I call book 10 Twinkle. And I can do this in book 1 with the kids, with the dot. Again, the point of the dot is, I don't want them to have to search for the spot. For this exercise, the spot they need to find easy. The exercise is about this and not finding the spot when they're in book 1. That's why I leave this dot. Book 10 Twinkle, I call it book 10 because I call this book 10 posture. This is book 1 posture. You can do rigadoon, you can do allegro, but you know, at a certain point in time, book 1 posture does not carry into the future. When you get into book 10, right? When you get into book 10, this is book 10 posture. So here we go. Twinkle with book 10 posture. So instead of playing the open strings, you play the harmonic instead. And there are a couple of things that are important about this exercise. One, again, is that we're squared around with our shoulders. One is that we're releasing tension in our hand every time we move. One is you gotta come back and find the first position. You got to come back and find our target. We've got to have our muscle memory, okay? And so this is something I set up way back in book 1 because the kids can do this, especially like in group class. Let me mention one last thing, and then we're going to get to the book. My first shifting experience that I give to my kids is actually 4th position. Even though I've already said that this is old-fashioned, you know, that old Harvey Whistler book that was all 4th position, you know, is what I was brought up with. I like fourth position as the first shifting experience because it's so easy to find. You put your thumb here in the saddle, put first finger opposite, and you're there. And so I like to teach a Twinkle on one string. And so on. I don't have to play the whole thing for you all. Again, we find the spot easily, and then they gotta find their way back. And every time they move, they release the tension on their thumb. Last thing about this one is I love to teach what I call elephant twinkle. The idea being not only are we doing this where we're bringing our arm around to play on the lower strings, and you're going to find that in my book. A lot of work I've put on the lower strings because it forces the shoulder and the elbow into the position that we really need to have. All right, so all of this concept about how to move around the instrument and how to release tension and how to identify muscle memory, that's sort of gonna pervade the rest of our discussion here. So let's look at page 3. By the way, in case most of what I have just said is in the notes to students. Have your students read those notes, okay?
Rick, I've got a question.
Yeah.
How did you come to this great idea about making a target practice and a geography quiz and names and numbers? I'm sorry, not about the target practice, but the geography quiz and the names and numbers. I have not seen anybody do this.
Thank you for asking. That's a great question, and I was going to talk about that. Here's my point. We have to have muscle memory. We have to have ears, but we've got to also have head knowledge. Because what we need to do is be able to recognize the stuff we have learned in the future so that we can apply it. And of a person that I know that I respect very, very much as a music educator has defined true knowledge as when you have learned something in one situation and can apply it in a context that's different from the one in which you learned it. And I think that's amazing. I think that's important because if a student does not know the name of a note, if the student does not understand the head knowledge, then when they see it in the future, they don't recognize it and they cannot apply their past experience. Therefore, every piece becomes like a blank slate, kind of start from scratch, play by ear kind of thing. And it's the knowledge part in this book is half of it. So I feel like there are 3 things going on in this book, and in general, all my books now. One is we learn how to find positions using the targets and the geography of the fingerboard. 2 is that we learn knowledge that hopefully allows us to apply this in other situations. And 3 is that we learn how to read it. This book actually becomes part of my reading program. Now, I don't know, I'll just say this. One of the long-standing, old-fashioned criticisms of the Suzuki method is that students don't learn to read. I find that a terribly unfair thing. Because a system, a method is only as good as a teacher who implements it, okay? And if a student in the old days was not a good player, nobody said, oh, well, that Coomer method was bad. Nobody ever said that. They said the teacher was bad, okay? But these days, someone doesn't read well, they're saying, oh, that Suzuki system doesn't teach the kids to read. That's wrong. The teacher did not teach the students to read. There's nothing about the Suzuki method that's bad about that. Nothing in the Suzuki method says you should not teach your students to read. It's up to the teacher to make that happen, okay? And so I have, along with I do all the Suzuki sequence as it is. I supplement with a few extra pieces, but that's our repertoire, and that's the way we apply our knowledge. That's where we learn certain specific technical and musical ideas. But parallel with that is I've got an entire reading program where the students every week will work on just reading. And this is like the third book in my reading program. So not only does it supplement our knowledge of the positions and our ability to find the places, but it gives us practice in reading it and recognize it when it's written on the page. So I might as well say this right now. There's two things I can say about this book right now. One, the way I made the sections of the books means that you can take any section in any order, because upper second position, just because we're looking at that page, it only requires first position and upper second. The only two positions involved in any of those pieces in that section of the book, that's it. If you like fourth position first, go there. First position, fourth position, that's all that's required. First and fourth and first and fourth. It does not require knowledge of any of the in-betweeners. The only time that you have to have a summarizing knowledge is at the end of the book, and we'll get there and we'll talk about it. At the very end of the book is what I call various positions and the contents, yes, various positions. To me, I would call that the summarizing section, where any position is fair game here, and what you got to do is recognize it and use it. None of it's really new, but it's, the rest of the book, though, you can go from one place to the next.
Still, why did you decide to go for upper second position first and not, for example, fourth position? Does that have a reason?
The way this evolved, and honestly, I'm thinking, because I really don't remember, it's been some years now, right? The way this evolved is these positions in this book are introduced in the same order that they show up in the Suzuki repertoire. And that made sense, okay? Another thing is the way I've constructed the targets and the way I've constructed the target practice and the daily exercise is you start with something you already know and do the new thing with it, okay? And that gives, again, a muscle memory sort of knowledge connection for the students. Starting here seemed to make sense to me. And then you go to here and you use this target then to find other positions, and that's fine. But it just made sense. We'll just move in this way. The other thing I was going to say about this is there are people, and I believe it's possible to do this. I'm not making a criticism here. There are people who use this book to introduce these positions, and that's fine with me. That's totally fine. But I don't actually use that in my system. I introduce these positions in the Suzuki repertoire as it comes up, and I use this book as a supplement to that, to give them more experience with it, and again, the reading aspect, okay? But it can be done. I mean, I guess one of the reasons that the book works is that people can use it in a whole bunch of different ways according to their own approach to things. All right, so let me get back to page 3 here. And since I've talked about concepts so much so far, I'm going to just start saying things that I think will relate back and try not to lecture long, okay? Number 1, give them an exercise that they can do correctly on their own at home. Make certain that they're going to practice correctly all week. Number 2, very short, very specific, with lots of repetition. Okay, so finding the D, which we've been working on, you know, all the things I showed you about coming back to the D, right? We know this by now. We don't need a tape there anymore because it's in our muscle memory. Well, let's put 2 on it and match it against an open D to make certain that it's always correct. I like the harmonic exercise because it forces them to move their hand. If I'm here, this is fine, there's nothing wrong with this, but it's too easy to sort of get planted on that spot. This one makes you move and get back. The geography quiz and the names and numbers I was going to mention, I'm so glad you asked me that question. One of the things that I have discovered and one of the reasons why I wanted to have this conversation with you, I found some people that skip this. Don't skip this. Don't skip this. My students find it really, really hard at first. Okay, you got to understand, it's hard. And I spend lesson time teaching them the system. Okay, we got to find this note. What target is nearby? What finger are you going to put the target on? What is the name? What is the distance you have to go for the note we're asking about? And therefore, what is your fingering pattern? Okay, and you know what? All the way through all my books, all the way through, thumb position book 2. This is the system. Know a target, know the name, know the distance, know the finger pattern, and boom, you're there, right? You're there, whatever, you're there, if you have that knowledge. Otherwise, it's all by ear, it's all fishing around, you know, and so that's it. Don't skip the geography quiz. Matter of fact, some of my colleagues, I thought I might not put them in position pieces book 2. And they said to me, no way, we want those. Put them in. And so I did.
Yes.
Okay. So you really, and I want to repeat this because it's true. My students find it really hard at first, and I have to devote lesson time to help them decipher the system. If you look at names and numbers, for instance, you know, the first note is given. This is on page 4 now. Given as D with 2. All right, and then you got to say, all right, what's the name of the next note? And they got to tell you, it's C sharp. And then you got to say, how far away is that from D? They'll say half step, semitone. And then what finger are you going to use? Well, 1. I mean, it's got to be that system. And that's what I spend lesson time teaching them. And you know what? By the time they get to book 2 of position pieces, they already know how to do this. You know, yeah. It's just like any other learning experience. It's really hard at first. Okay. So let's start looking at some of the pieces. And I think, again, just because of the concept discussion, there's not a whole lot left to talk about except to show you some of the pieces. The fanfare, one of the things that I tried to, I should say this. When I did double stops for cello, I chose folk songs. And I chose folk songs because they were supposed to be familiar, kind of to the ear. And again, I wanted my students to know that they were doing it correctly when they got home. When I started working on this book, I thought about that. Well, and I decided not only do folk songs just not fit into the sort of rigid sort of pattern things that I wanted to teach, but I didn't actually want the kids to know how it sounded ahead of time. I wanted them to figure it out. This is not one I want them to play by ear. Now, I know that there are people on the web who have recorded these pieces, and I feel really good about that, that people like them well enough that they're recording them and they're making them available. But I would ask you teachers, don't let your students learn it by listening to the web. Have them learn it on their own first. And then if they want to listen to the example on the web to see if they've learned it correctly, that's good, see. But don't let them learn these pieces by ear. Make them figure it out, okay? And what I've tried to do is build into the pieces these target practices already. You're gonna know if that first note's in tune or not because it's a target practice built into the actual song. Okay, then here we go. F sharp G, A, F sharp G. You gotta know the names. And that's the thing, you know. I can get off on another thing, which I probably shouldn't do because I see we're running out of, I'm already going over my time. I think we gotta have words, we gotta have labels, we gotta have names. Otherwise, you cannot communicate about it. Otherwise, you cannot relate to the future. I'll go ahead and say it, and if we get out of time, we can do a part 2 later, all right? But I saw, there are two extremes here. I saw a master class. Kid played, I don't know what they played, relatively advanced piece for this master teacher. Master teacher spent 20 minutes talking to the kid and let them go. And I'm going, whoa, man, he didn't have a chance to see if the student understood what he was saying. He didn't listen to the student, give it back to him. He didn't give them any hints on what they're supposed to do when they go home. It was all just talking. And I believe when I do teacher training, and when we ask teachers to record themselves and giving a lesson and listen to it, almost everyone says, wow, I talk too much. So I think we got to be careful. What you do in a lesson, it's much more important than what you say, okay? You need to do the thing with the student so the student experiences what it is that you're trying to describe. Because let's face it, when it comes to making a sound, when it comes to moving your body, there are certain things you simply cannot say in words until the students have actually experienced it. On the other hand, here's the other extreme. I got into a big argument with a piano teacher once who claimed that you should not say any words in a lesson at all. And the reason was that music is a language unto itself. And if you try to describe it in words, you are limiting it. And it's like the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Because, yeah, music, you cannot describe music. You have to feel music, but you're trying to teach a student how to do things. And you have to use words because words are how we communicate. So what I've developed are what I call trigger words, okay? When I do this with my shoulders and my body, this is, by the way, again, Margaret Rowell, I call this bird wings. You do bird wings, you feel your shoulder blades and the big muscles in your back, and you feel that all balancing on the instrument, and I help the students feel that, especially when I used to teach in person, and I'd go over and grab their shoulders and help them with that, right? From now on, I'm going to call that bird wings. And that's all I got to say. Once they've experienced it, we got words to go with it, okay? All to say, once again, the students have got to know the names of the notes they're playing. If I may tell you another story, I'm just rambling. I'm so apologetic here. I took one of my students to play for my old teacher, Eleanor Schoenfeld, and he was playing the Saint-Saëns Concerto. He was a very, very good student, or I wouldn't have taken him. And he was playing, and she stopped and said, "What's the name of that note?" And I knew he could figure it out. But before he could, she said, "Too late. You've got to know now. What is the name of the note? Further, you may have to know a second before you got to play it. What is the name of the note? Or you can't get in place and in position to make it accurate and consistent and reliable." Okay? So look at what we're doing here at about a book 2/3 level. We're teaching students how to deal with stuff that they're going to need when they're playing major repertoire in the future. This idea of you know what you're doing, you know how you do it, and you can replicate it reliably at will once you recognize it, okay? So that's fanfare. F sharp, G, A, F sharp, G, that's the lesson. Skating is very much the very same thing. The Elephant's Waltz, I'm looking now at page 6 and 7. Elephant's Waltz and Whale's Song is very much the same issue, but I like to put them down, like I was saying to you earlier, I like to put them down on the lower strings. Because it forces their elbow and their shoulder into the proper place for the balance of the hand, okay? And here again, I like to give the students something that if they're even doing it, you know it's right. And that way they always do it correctly. I like March on page 8. One of the reasons I like March is because now we're going to start talking about the village, all right? If I look at like measure 5 in the march, now you'll notice there's a little target practice checkup in that. But the real issue is here I am sitting on D. We all know that. That's very cool. I'm good at that now. Oh, but guess what? I also know F sharp. I also know A. I also know C sharp, right? And all of those notes lie there. If I've got that head knowledge, anytime I need to find it in the future, it's there for me. I want to talk, bugle call and toy soldiers on page 10. They're very important to me. There are two things here. One is I've tried to sneak in a few issues, a few technical and notational issues that I was never taught. And this diamond-shaped note head thing, this is something that nobody ever told me about it. You show up in orchestra and you see it, and what am I supposed to do with this? Well, it's easy, you just have to be taught. And what it means is you put your finger in the spot where that note would normally be played, but instead of playing that note, you play the harmonic that lives right in the same spot. And it's not even hard, right? It's not hard to explain, but they have to learn it. Second reason I like it is the harmonics, especially this F sharp. It's a little persnickety there. If you're not in exactly the right place, you don't get the sound. So here again, it forces the student's hand to be exactly in the right shape in order to even make the sound.
I've got a question about the bugle call and the toy soldiers. Most of the students are very glad to come into toy soldiers because they all think it's easier than a bugle call because of the rhythm. Why did you decide to first put the bugle call and then the toy soldiers?
Bugle call is mainly because it's taps in the United States. I don't know if you guys do this. It's called, there's another word for it too. It's a very common sound, bugle call. This is what they do at military funerals, for instance, okay? And to me, this whole, let me find the right spot. That's the wrong place. The whole point of a bugle is there are no valves. And so the bugle is playing only the overtone series, right? And so we can recreate virtually any bugle call by using the natural harmonics on our string. And so, and as I said, bugle call, I don't know what it's like in places outside the United States, but it's almost a cliche in every movie that, you know, when they get a sad place, they hear the bugle call, the taps. British have got another name for it. The last, I can't remember the other name, but it was famous enough that I felt like their ear could help them with that one. And then toy soldiers is a completely new thing, which they have to figure out on their own because it isn't something they may have in their ear. Okay. Now, I happen to like Lament very much because I think it's a really pretty song. I don't pretend that any of these pieces are great art, but this one's really kind of. And here again, you see. Here's my fingering pattern. Okay. I must talk with you about page 12. The invisible target is a very important one to me. And I talk to my students about it. Tell me, I say to them, tell me, you're going to find that A with fourth finger. So what target are you going to use? Well, by now, they're very good at knowing that it's a G. But then I say, please look at the key signature. Are you ever going to get to play that G? And the answer is, well, no, because it's G sharp. But we're still going to use the G to find our spot. That's why I call it the invisible target. And if I want to, I say to him, it could be called the inaudible target, but that seemed weird. So I called it the invisible target. You find it, and it puts you in place for all these other notes. It's a little bit of a mind trip. You're going to play find a note that you're not actually going to play. But that target, that landmark still exists and puts you in the right place for all the rest of them. Pachyderm parade is exactly the same on the lower strings. Okay? So I think we can flip pretty quickly through this now. Extended second position is the same issue. We're going to find the target first, and then we're going to find the fingering pattern second. The geography quiz, there's going to be a difference between a 1 and an X1, okay? And that you're going to have to know whether it's a half a step or a whole step. And so that's again, the knowledge part. I particularly like to talk about Eric's Minuet in this on page 17. First of all, Eric's Minuet is my direct connection with that moment I talked to you about in the Witches' Dance before. Because here we go. want to do this. Sorry, I missed it. I don't want to do that, because if I do that, I'm out of place for all the rest of the notes. So I want to think about this note first and the finger pattern that arrives on all of the notes all at the right time. Then, you know, next thing is a little bit of a joke. You may have noticed, some of you, that I have a funny sense of humor sometimes. I had a family came with me, and they wanted to know why it was called Eric's Minuet, and they had made up a whole thing about my son and blah, blah, blah. And no, it's Eric Satie. It's Eric Satie. My Groves is actually pretty nasty on Eric. They treat him bad. They talk about him being a mediocre pianist and composer. But he wrote those gymnopédie pieces, which are very famous, to the point that even in the 1970s, a rock group called Blood, Sweat, and Tears played one of them. And the accompaniment part is this. Right? If you listen to those gymnopédie pieces, that's what the bass line's all about. So I call it Eric's Minuet. A little trivia. Lower third position. I like lower third position, again, because here I am with this place. We've already put second finger there. Now we're going to put first finger there. And by now that becomes fairly automatic. Target practice every single day. Okay? We don't forget that one of the things, and by the way, I didn't say this yet. One of the things I wanted to do in this book is simply give the students enough opportunity to have repetition so that they can do things many times correctly. And the problem with the repetition in the old books is that the things they were asked to repeat were so boring. You know, they're so dumb. And yeah, they hit the point, but who wants to do, you know, the Whistler book, right, anymore? So I wanted to give them different pieces that are tuneful and fun to play, and yet hit the same point over and over and over again. Which is why, again, no matter what, here's I keep apologizing because I tell my students, how do you make a good habit? The answer is you do it correctly over and over again. And this, you know, the students will come back with, yeah, you do it over and over. I say, yeah, but you're missing a word there. Go ahead.
What I like so much about your pieces is that they have got very different musical atmospheres. And I mean, you talk about repetition and, for example, Dotzauer and again, but these atmospheres are so nice for the students to realize with their bows too. And that's what I like so much about your book.
Thank you. And yeah, there are some fairly nice pieces in here that you can do musical things with besides just the technical things. So that's nice. Yeah, so in other words, I tell my students that I tell them this way. I am asking you to do this over and over again because you're doing it right. I'm not asking you to do it because it's wrong. It's because you're doing it right that I want you to do it over and over again. And it's not a punishment that I'm asking you to repeat this thing, you know? And that's, again, I say target practice every day. Now, the Teenage Monster on page 22 is definitely one of the top 10 hits in this book. Everybody likes this piece. And so I don't need to tell you much about it. It's got the low notes again, the low string that I was really interested in dealing with. Okay. For your information, when I was a child, there was a TV show on called The Munsters, and it was about a family. It was a black and white half-hour show about a family of monsters that sort of lived. And they were pretty. It was funny. It was a comedy, and their theme song was sort of a 1960s rock and roll kind of song, and that's what this is supposed to be. Okay, we got a little 1960s rock and roll going on here. People ask me if that's a autobiographical piece, and I always refuse to answer. I take the Fifth Amendment on that one. All right, so here we go again. All right. I said this earlier, I want to repeat it. What I have decided about getting around the instrument is that whenever possible, I love to use my second finger because it balances my hand. If I'm using first finger, it's too often weird. If I'm using second finger, I have a balance. Having said that, there are times when you simply have to use first finger, right? So here's this and here's this. So fine, you deal with that. Also, you're going to use third finger. Here's this for lower second. Fine. But as much as possible, and if you and I ever get a chance to talk about Position Pieces Book 2, you'll hear about how I dealt with all of that up here. Okay, yeah. And the idea being that I'm defining a lot of my terms based on the second finger, not so much from a theory point of view, but from a teaching point of view. Okay, so here again, I've got homework. Well, third finger on the target. False Triste on page 26 happens again to be one of my nice ones. I think it's a pretty song. And and Sicilian. I love Sicilian for two reasons. One is it introduces the idea and the dance rhythm of a Sicilian. And we are going to see Sicilians in our repertoire in the future. Another reason why I like it is the point as I get a chance to talk about the bowing, which I call a zigzag bow. The zigzag bow is dependent upon saving on the first bow, so you get a little teeny zigzag here. And we're going to find this here. Is the common mistake, yes? Save. And do a little zigzag, and you don't get that huge bump in your bow. I use zigzags constantly in Bach. I use zigzags constantly in poppers. So there's that. Okay, fourth position. Oh yeah, I got to talk to you about fourth position. I got to talk to you about Busy Bees on page 34. This is another one of the top 10 in this book. People really like it. I think teachers really like Busy Bees. I have tried many times to not include a lot of technique in these pieces. They're supposed to be pieces that are relatively obvious orally and relatively easy technically. And I keep coming back to say this, I want my students to always do it correctly when they get home, so I don't want to make it complicated. Busy bee is hard though, but I love it. This whole thing about putting your fourth finger on the C string and having to play an open G, you know, that is really, really good training. But the students do find it a challenge, especially at the speed that I have asked for it. And this, to relate back to our previous discussion, this is a place where you get to bring out your Kummer exercise from the double stops book. Okay, so it's a really good piece. Now, upper third, I don't believe there's anything surprising in upper third. The point of upper third being, now that we have encountered fourth position and all of these targets, now we're going to put 2 on it. And there we are in upper third, okay? So again, we'll start with something that we already know and apply a different finger to it. And so the relationship becomes obvious. And again, I say the muscle memory should work. Extended third is the same idea, being you're going to find this target, but then your hand's going to open. On page 45, it's worth noting again that I have used the bugle call again, noting that the same harmonic, sorry, this one, this is the same as this one, right? And so it's kind of worth noticing that. And it's worth noticing, again, if you don't have your fingers in exactly the right place, the sound just simply doesn't happen. So that's another reason why I like the harmonics here. One of my colleagues, somebody was talking about this book on Facebook recently, and one of my colleagues wrote, yeah, one of my boys' students refused to play the tiny ballerina until I crossed out the title and I said, big, fat, hairy ballerina. And then he played it. So go for it, have some fun. Half position for me was almost an afterthought. I kind of was working on the book, and I kind of went, wait, you better do half position, because where else in the world do we really get a chance to become familiar with half position? So I'm really, really glad there is a trap in the shark on page 49. Let me find it. Right, this is it. If we start in shark on measure 5, we find ourselves in regular normal first position. Now, when students up here go to this measure, if they're not really careful, they forget they got to play a B flat, and they play wrong notes. It's got to be. So there's a trap built into that. And there are some traps, like in Baroque Concerto, there's a few traps that if you're not careful, you fall into it. The rest of these, I think, are pretty straightforward. I happen to like Spanish dance very much. I think it's fun to play on page 52. I think it's fun to play, and the teachers got some good stuff to play in this one. And one of the things I'm finding Zoom lessons are working very, very well, but one of the things I'm missing is not playing these duets with my students. So, yeah, but when you get there, when you're playing duets, Spanish dance is fun. Now, beginning with at the ball. And here again, I don't believe I need to talk too much longer. But beginning with at the ball, now we're in the summarizing section, where you have to look at the name of the note and look at the finger. By the way, I should say this too. This is in the introduction, but I want to say it. I have tried very hard to make sure my markings say like this. If you do not see a fingering, it means you do not have to shift. So the student is supposed to say, oh, if there's no fingering there, I'm not supposed to move my hand. I got to figure out whether it is in that spot. Now, frankly, one person got mad at me once because they read that wrong. They read it, if you do see a fingering, it means you do have to shift. Well, that's not true. That's not true, because I put in lots of reminder sort of courtesy fingerings. But it is true that if you do not see a fingering, you do not have to shift, and you're supposed to figure out how to play the notes in the place where you are right now, okay? But here again, the fingering starts in fourth position, it goes to second position at the ball, it ends up with extended second position because it's a C natural, none of which is new. But this is now the summarizing place. This is the place where we take the knowledge we learn from the whole rest of the book and apply it, okay? There are probably two things worth saying. Melancholy. Melancholy is one of the first places where I introduced the chromatic pattern. You guys should know this, that in fact, I did not try to include every single possibility in the entire universe in this book. One of the reasons is that there's a scale book out there. You all know it. The scale book costs about $50. The scale book's got all the scales and all the bowing patterns with a little separate book that has all the rhythm patterns. And it's like everything in the world is in there. And consequently, I find it unwieldy. I find it impossible to use and impossible to teach because it's too much, you know? And what I made some conscious decisions here. And one of them was, you know what? I don't have to teach a chromatic pattern. I don't have to write a whole section of the book on the chromatic pattern. Once you know the system, once you find a target, and once you know the distances between notes, well, the chromatic pattern's easy. Here again, for your information, F sharp, G sharp, A sharp does not appear in this book, okay? And it was a conscious decision I made, is that at a certain point in time, it becomes unwieldy. And if you know the targets, if you know the invisible targets, you can find that. If you know how to run the system, you can deal with any circumstance that comes up. And I don't need to write an entire section of the book on every possible thing that's out there. So melancholy starts this. Here. Now that's not amazingly weird because we've been in second position, but there is our chromatic pattern. One of the reasons that I bring that up is when we get to Jack Sprat and his wife, I introduce another thing that is not a section in the book, it's extended fourth position. All right, so here again, my idea is if we know fourth position, and if I go like this, it's not that hard. But I do have to warn my students about it. I do have to ask them ahead of time. You all know Jack Sprat, yes, the mother goose? Jack Sprat could eat no fat. His wife could eat no lean. And so between the two of them, they licked the platter clean. So what that means is Jack Sprat was skinny because he didn't eat any fat, and his wife was not, which is a little bit the opposite of Mr. and Mrs. Mooney. She's real skinny, and I am not. But the point is, here's our little dance here. Sorry, I missed the note. We got Jack Sprat and the wife. And of course, the reason is, again, to notice what is the connection across the strings. And knowing when you're here, what is available over there, along with what I've been saying about playing on the low strings for the proper posture. One last thing to say, and then I think I'm done, and then you can ask me any questions you have. I got the blues on 60, what is that, 5, 3. I put the words in here. I put the words in here because when you notate things like the blues with these triplets and stuff, the rhythms become complicated. And again, I didn't want the rhythms to be the point of the piece. I wanted it to be our targets and our patterns, and I wanted it to be fun. And so you got to have words, right? I got, what is that, A? I got the blues, baby, right? I got the blues, baby. Use the words, figure out the rhythms, have fun with the song, okay? And I will admit to you that this was only the second book I published. That when I put this out, I was a little worried that people were going to find some of this stuff too silly. But I have a friend who kind of encouraged me. He said, you know, people got to have a sense of humor. You know, just got to. Turns out people really liked it. People liked the funny titles. People liked the words. And therefore, in my subsequent books, I continued in the same vein. There's lots of little jokes in the titles. And there's some words that go in that are supposed to be just fun, that don't really mean anything to technique or playing the cello, but it's supposed to be an enjoyable way to play the instrument, right? And so I continued with that. And the
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. This is so much great information. I'm so glad that it wasn't, you know, about me who, when I first used this book like 15 or 18 years ago, I was wondering, so the Americans use upper second, lower second, and it's so nice to hear from you. That's your way to name these positions, and it's absolutely clear why you do. And it's also very nice to hear that you are suggesting that if people want to, that you can set the chapters apart, like first going for a fourth position or whatever. It's not dogmatic at all.
Right.
It's very free to use. And you gave so much information before you started with page 3, which is so very welcome. Thank you very much for that.
Yes, and I can only apologize for talking about 30 minutes longer than I expected to. But I hope it's all useful. And like I said, to me, what's important about this is really the concept and the way to play and the way to teach and what you teach your students to allow them to be successful and take that knowledge and use it in the future. And to me, that's the real key. And the pieces are supposed to be fun. They're supposed to have teaching points. They're supposed to have repetition. But the real issue is, by the time my kids get out there into the big repertoire, they can do it because we started it way back here.
Yes, yes. And Rick, did I get this right that you are inviting me to have a guided tour through Position Pieces number 2?
Yes, yes, you got that right.
Wonderful.
I'm very happy that I have this connection with you, and you have an audience, and I can get some of this stuff out. And I know you occasionally put it up on Facebook when you and I have done these things, so other people can tune in, because it turns out that it is useful, I think, for people to hear the behind the scenes issues and what I was thinking about when I was doing it. And it helps them to understand it better and apply it better in their own teaching. And yeah, second position or Position Pieces book 2, maybe one of the most unique books that I did. There's not a lot of books that deal with these 3-finger patterns that Starkey used to call them, the 3-finger patterns. There's not a lot. And so I'd be very happy to do that with you. Let's look into the new year and find a time.
Absolutely. You were talking about my audience. I will put this up into my YouTube channel, which is named Cello Verkoop and Cello Lessons. That's
Mm,
Dutch. And yes, I will put this in my podcast because even without people, even when they do not have the opportunity to get their book, it's very good to hear what you are saying. So I'll put this in my podcast, Cello Spelen met Scarlett. And yes, we will share this on Facebook because, you know, Rick, the good thing is when I first got acquainted with you by Facebook, is that you are not a distant person, but you're real and
mm,
really approachable. And it's so nice to know the person from whom you are buying the books. These are
yeah,
your books. So that's so nice. Thank you very much for giving us the opportunity.
excellent. And it's so good to see you again. And let me not talk on and on and on. I'm happy to. I think I've said everything I need to say for today, and I'll look forward to visiting you again pretty soon.
Yes, for everybody, Happy New Year because today is Old Year's Eve, Old Year's morning in California. I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you everybody for hanging into this video. Bye bye.